before I start talking. Awesome. I'll start sharing my screen so we can start. Let me begin. So to give a bit short intro about me, I'm Prabir. I'm one of the engineering managers at Microsoft, and I'll be giving a talk about learning Vimscript. So the topic is really not about the editor, like why you should move to Vim or why or how to use the Vim, but it's rather about how to use Vimscript. So it's a pretty beginner's talk. One of the big things I had issues when learning Vimscript is I could not find any articles or videos. There's lots of videos around the internet about like, oh, this is how you should do, this is how you should configure your plugins, but there's nothing much about Vimscript. And I think it's a really important because as you start expanding your Vim, like you want to get control of the entire editor. So that's hopefully that's what this talk is going to lead you to. So if you don't know me, I've worked on several of the open source Vim projects. You can see Vim LSP, which is a language server protocol. There's async-complete.vim, which is again autocomplete plugin. There's quick-pick, which is similar to Control-P FZF. There's some utils, async, and callback.vim. I also wrote the original TypeScript language server, which I gave it to someone else because there was a lot better contributor for that too. This talk is not about Vimscript 9. So we will not cover Vim 9 if that's what you're looking for. It's going to be purely on Vimscript or VimL, whatever you like to call it. It's going to be what ships with less than 8 or 8. So the first thing is you most likely already are using Vimscript. If you have not, you're most likely not aware of it. And also, one thing I do want to mention is all of the code snippets I paste out here, you can actually in the future go back to the recording and then just write these, copy paste, or just play around with it. I'm not sure if you'll be able to catch up with me while I talk, but that's one thing that's possible. Around more than 90% of the code snippets will work. So the first thing is you can go : echo hello world, right? So this is actually a Vimscript you're typing in command. You're most likely changing your color scheme, setting some variables, getting anything. So that's really the hello world of Vimscript. You can also do a multi-line Vimscript, but then you'll have to do : let message equals to hello world. So you're saving that message in a variable, and then you're doing echo message. So that's really what the Vimscript is. The problem with this is like, hey, how do I save it to a file? I don't want to continue to copy paste in my command. So what you can actually do is move that same code you wrote to vimrc, right? So if you're writing vimrc, you're already writing Vimscript, right? So hopefully you at least have written like 1 or 2 lines of Vimscript or even more, but that's really what it is. Now, the problem with echo is as soon as you have your second echo, it actually clears your first echo. So there's another thing called echo M, which actually allows you to persist the message. So you can actually go back and look at it. Why is this important? It's because what I like to call it as hello-driven development, where you continue to type echo M and then like, hey, what is the actual value of this? Primarily given that there's no good debugger. So you can actually use the : messages to see that, if you're trying to find some bugs or just trying to log, that's one of those ways to actually do that. What is Vimscript? Now, this will be the last slide. I'm going to use less than equal 8. It's interpreted. It's imperatives, most like what if the language you are using, Python, C, Lua. It's fairly similar. It's dynamic in language, so there's no static typing. There is partial runtime checks. So by what I mean by partial runtime checks is there are cases where it'll actually check whether you're passing a string versus a number, or if you're passing 5 arguments versus 2 arguments. So there's a bunch of few runtime checks that might happen. It's also functional, which means functions are first class. You can save functions to a variable. You can create closures. lots of things you can do there. It also has a simple object-oriented concept. I will not dig into this. I'm actually not a huge fan of the object-oriented aspect in Vim, but it is possible if you want. I would suggest start the object-oriented Vim later and try to do other functional style as possible, because once you start going object-oriented, it talks about a few more extra concepts which might throw you off, right? So start without learning. Help is your best friend. Use it, right? I use it a lot. The reason it's really important is because Vim is not a language I write every time, which means you need to learn how to use help, because I might be looking at my open source project or even my script I wrote like 6 months back or even 2 years back and have like no idea what this function does now. So I do a help. So let's get started. Variables. There's multiple types of variables. Like almost any language, we have a string, you have a number, you have a float. It's really important to understand that number and float are different. Number is usually the integer, the whole numbers you know. In other languages, float is usually the double, decimal, or whatever you call it. You also have a null. We also have a dictionary. This might be familiar to objects. In JavaScript or some other language. List is familiar to an array. It's not a static size. It's a dynamic growing array list. You have funcref. As I mentioned, you can store the function itself. There are also special types of other variables like jobs, channels, and blob. We will not dig into these, but it is possible. Blob is especially useful if you're working with binary data. So how do you create a variable? You just do let variable name equals the value, right? You can put a string. Again, number and float is different. It's a dynamic language. You can have a list of multiple different types. It does not have to be the same. It can be 1, 2, hello world string. It can be a list inside a list. You have a dictionary that just looks like it. You do need to put the quotes in the dictionary, even for the key. You can also use multi-line statements because as your list grows longer or as your program gets longer, it might not fit in the column width that you are expecting. So you can use the backslash at the front. Now, this is something you can use almost anywhere in the code, not just while initializing variables. So something to watch out. It also really doesn't matter whether you put the brackets at the same line or in the new line. It's really your way at how you want to do. There are, however, like few gotchas that you got to be aware of, and that's primarily with comments. Like this is actually an invalid Vimscript. So you cannot put comments in a multi-line statement. So something to really watch out. This is something that really throws me off. I really wish Vim had this, but you got to move all your comments either up or down. This is not possible. It's an invalid code. There are also special variables which starts with v:, and almost all the variables that starts with v:, are all read-only. So you actually cannot modify these. There are a lot more. We'll go as we come. So there's v:, true, there's v:, false, there's v:, null. Do watch out that if you are using older versions of Vim, these might not exist. So we'll talk about a bit later at how to use. So now the biggest thing about Vimscript is, hey, I told you that we have functions, we have objects, but like, hey, when I do this, what is the scope of Vim? And it really depends. For example, if you're writing flat on your Vimscript, which is a vimrc, it's going to treat it as global variable. But if you put it inside functions, it's going to treat it as something else. And there's lots of different types of scopes besides just function scopes or block scope, or just global scope, right? So something to really watch out. So what I tend to do is prefix it with some character, and this is not a random character that I came up with. This is actually how Vim treats it. So you can actually create a global script, global scope variable with g:, inside a function, or you can create a script level. Global basically means You can access this variable anywhere, anytime. Even other plugins, other scripts can do. S colon is private only to that script, so only to that file. By script, I mean file. L means local variable. So if you're inside a function, that's really what you're doing. B colon is for buffer. So you can actually save buffers of local variables. W for window and T for tab. This is not my format. This is really what Vim talks with. Functions. You start with a function. You code G colon. Is not required, but because this is a global function, I started with G colon just to be there. Then you can pass arguments. You can pass however number of arguments you want, and you can actually access it with a special variable called A colon, which means argument name, and script greeting, which is hello. And then you can call using call G colon greet. One thing to really watch out is Vim is really weird in a language. If you are creating a function that is global, it has to be a capitalized G. It can't be small g. So if you're very strong into naming, Vimscript will actually keep changing your habits out there. And again, the dot is the concatenation. So what here I'm trying to do is I'm going to concatenate hello space and the name, and that's really what it is. Now, there's problem with this particular code, and the problem with this particular code in this script file is S colon greeting is not defined, A colon name is not defined, right? So I'm using a variable that does not exist, which means there is an error in my script. So when I actually call greet, it's going to fail. Now, unlike most of the languages you use, the biggest issue with Vimscript is it will just continue to execute your code instead of just like pausing, right? So you can have a lot more bigger issues than this. So the way to solve this is by using the abort at the end of it. So you will sometimes think like, hey, why are people adding abort? And this abort basically now tells is, hey, whenever I get into a first error, just stop processing, right? And just mark that enter function as an error. Now, why do we explicitly need abort and not Vimscript didn't support it? Is because apparently the suggestion came later and we didn't want to break the Vimscript. So now we've got to deal with the history about like, hey, let's be backward compatible with older scripts and let's add abort. So my suggestion, always use abort. You can also use try catch. So you can throw exceptions, you can catch exception. Again, I have mentioned V colon is a special. There's also V colon exception, which will give you the exception message, and V colon throw point, which will actually give you the stack trace. So if you are using log, that's really useful. You can also catch a very specific error messages because exceptions in Vimscript is strings. You can use regex to catch a particular one. Usually the ones that are thrown by Vim, they have a special error code style that they use, which is caps E and then some number. So you can actually do :H E and then type the number and you'll most likely get to where it is. So in this case, it's actually going to fail primarily because, as I mentioned, it's a global variable, which is a function. So that's why I need to start H with a capital letter. And if it's a script level functions, you don't actually need to start with a caps letter. So another very important aspect is being able to use variable arguments. And you can use that with dot, or period, whatever you call it. Again, it's a very weird language, as in this is one place where there's an explicit type checking that happens. So if you pass a different number of arguments, Vim will actually not even allow you to call that function, right? So this is why sometimes you might have to use dot, or you explicitly want variables. The primary reason I use is because I don't know the length, or it's because I want to have a backwards compatibility with a public API from my plugin. A colon 0 is a very special variable which gives you the length of the total number of dot arguments that you have, and A1 is the first index of that arguments, the extra arguments you pass. You can also do A2, A3, and blah, blah, blah till A20. Now, Again, always validate your arguments if you are looking into it. Again, a colon 0 basically tells you gives you the length, and a1 starting from a1 it actually gives you the value of it. One really good thing I also like to use in Vimscript is the pipe operator for if. So it's rather than like having multiple lines, you can actually just continue to write it in the same line. In order to access the actual array, you can use a colon 0, 0, 0, and yes, that's not a made up. It is 3 zeros. You got to type. It's pretty weird in that, and because it is just a normal Vim list, you can start iterating over it. You can use whatever APIs it has, such as copy, filter, map, or even like add or remove whatever things you would want to add. You can use strings. Strings is another thing that I find it really difficult to use in Vim when I started, right? And it has lots of different issues with it. So first, concatenation. There's no plus operator. You use the dot operator to concatenate. So this is pretty simple. It'll be pretty easy to get used to. But one thing I've noticed is because I don't code Vim in much, what happens is like, if in the next 2-3 months I'm back into Vim, I'll again go and start using plus, and it's like, hey, why is my program not running? Is because it's dot. So something to watch out if you're using other languages that don't. I know that there are a few languages that does use dot, but plus is really not the operator for string concat. Another really important thing is the no ignore case, and the reason this is really important is people complain about the JavaScript equality operators, where it's like, oh, this is truthy, this is falsy, and there's a huge truth table. Well, Vim has something similar. It's not as bad as JavaScript, but it actually throws people off when you start it. So in this case, what I did was I, as a normal user, set my Vim setting to have a no ignore case. And what I can now do is when I compare these words, and if you look in my second call, I actually used a capital O instead of small o. So the thing is, it's going to behave completely different because it's not equal. So the way to solve this is look at what the operators are. And usually what happens is you usually never want to use this because this really depends based on user's configuration. So rather than using this, you most likely want to either use this, which is match case, or you want to ignore case, right? Which is equals equals hash, means you care about the case. Equal equal equation means you don't. So get used to this. One thing I would suggest is never use this ignore case, right? Always use match case and ignore case. Something really important to understand. Again, another thing that throws off is the single quote versus the double quote. There is no concept of char in Vimscript. Everything is just a string, so you don't have to worry. It's very similar like JavaScript, where you can either use single quotes or double quotes, but it will completely behave differently. So in this case, as you can see, /n is treated as /n in most of the programming languages, but here, because you use single quote, it's not going to put a new line. So the way to solve this is actually by using double quotes, and it'll actually print as expected. So something to really watch out, if you are using Vimscript. Another thing that I find really useful is the concept of slice, where it's a list, but instead of just passing a index to just get one character out of it, which is going to be type string, you can actually pass a range. You can pass the start range and the end range. So think of this as a substring. Both are optional. So if you leave the second part or the first part optional, it'll just use the default, which is the 0 or the length of it. So you can also use a negative indexes out here. It's really up to you. So substrings, that's really how you use string slice. There are a lot more functions about strings, but those are really the ones that is very different compared to other languages that you might be familiar with. List and dictionaries. So list works exactly like how arrays works, but it's dynamic, which means there's no fixed length. So I'm not going to be digging more into it. Dictionary is also very similar. But one thing I would highly suggest you to recommend is, learn the APIs that you need to manipulate or retrieve the list. You can use add to add items to a list or a dictionary. You can use remove to do the same. Has underscore key, that's a really important API, especially on dictionaries, because if you make things optional, you want to make sure that, hey, the dictionary works or has the value. Otherwise, again, there's partial runtime checks that happen, and you'll have some errors. Copy, that's if you want to copy the list into make a dupe of it. Keys are very important. It'll give you a list for all the keys of dictionary. There's also values. You can also use items, which actually gives you a list of which each type is a list, where the first index is the key and the second is value. So familiarize yourself with list or dictionary. Another really important thing is echo-m with type checking, right? Again, there are some functions that are built into Vim that explicitly checks for the type. For example, if you tell me, give me the buffer number for the particular buffer, or say, hey, go and focus into this buffer, you have to use type, which is of number. So what this basically allows you to do is there's a function called type, and it'll actually give you a constant, which is a number, but these constants are saved again as a v colon, which is a constant. So you can give v colon t underscore string. The only bad part about using that is if you're using older versions of Vim, it might not exist. So you'll actually get an error because v colon t underscore string does not exist. So the way to deal with this is, if you are really looking at, how do I support older version of Vim, you actually want to just do type and then just pass a string or an empty string. You can also pass type name, type funcref, type list, and I usually prefer the second one. I try to avoid v colon t string, but that's just for backward compatibility. Callbacks. So callbacks in Vim is used a lot, especially if you're using async functions. In this case, you have timer with 1000. So after 1000 milliseconds, it's going to fire the timer. But now the problem with this is, hey, I have a greet, I have a name, but where is the name, right? So I think that's a really huge problem. There's no concepts of similar closures as you see in other languages. So the way to do that is you can pass the second argument, and when you pass the second argument, it actually uses that as the first argument to your callback function. So you can actually, because it's a list, you can actually pass n number of arguments, and then after it uses those arguments, it actually passes timer. So that's one way to capture the variables that you want. So now you can finally access it. Starting with Vim 8, there was also concepts of lambda. So rather than using the funcref passing, you can actually use lambdas. The only issues with lambdas is you can't have multi-line statement. So it sort of sometimes defeats the purpose, but it is possible. Again, if you're trying to work on older versions of Vim to make it compatible, you most likely should not be using that. Events are, again, very popular ones that you need to use. You have auto CMD, cursor moved, comma, cursor I, so you can subscribe to any of the events you want for any file type, and then when that event gets fired, you call cursor moved. So that's one thing you can do. It's very powerful if you want to create things like autocomplete or any plugins. You need to subscribe to events, and this is really how you subscribe to events. Again, some events will actually give you certain particular event data, and you can access that by v colon event. Now, there's a huge problem with this particular code. I mean, it works, but the problem is if you, again, rerun your Vimscript, it's going to include multiple, it's going to register multiple events. So the way to solve that is register a group. And now what happens is it registers that all these events into a group. But again, there's still a problem. If you run your Vimscript second times, like where you're sourcing, the problem with this is it's actually going to subscribe to multiple times as you source it. So the way to solve that is use an auto CMD bang or exclamation mark, and that basically tells us, hey, I defined this group, which means if I source it again, remove all the events and then subscribe again, right? So now if I run, if I source my Vimscript again, it says, okay, clear everything in this group or run again. So the good part about this is you'll most likely only have one event registered, and this is most likely what you want. So that's really how you want to use auto CMD groups. So you most likely always will be using with groups and not in a single. Now let's go and write a plugin. So you can actually, if you're looking into writing a plugin, I highly recommend you to read this. You can do :h write dash plugin. I'm not going to write exactly what this is, but feel free to follow in the help. So the first thing is, this is how I write plugins. The way to do this is, rather than figuring out, hey, where I'm going to put my plugins, how I'm going to source it, you're most likely already using a plugin manager. In this case, I'm using Vimplug. So just use a Vimplug. You don't actually have to have a GitHub repository right there. What I do is I go to a folder where I have all my Vim config. I put my GitHub user account / whatever the plugin I want. Then the next thing I do is I create a folder which has plugin / hello-world.vim. Usually that hello world is the same name as plugin name I create. It doesn't matter, but I suggest use this format. And then I also go and create a doc folder where I put the plugin name .text. Right. Then in plugin, so plugin, anything under plugin gets executed all the time when you source your Vim RC for the first time. So when Vim is actually loading for the first time, it'll actually run this file. And the way to solve this, the reason it sort of runs it, this is really the time when you want to register your events or want to do something else. The other thing to also know is usually there's a pattern where people always check if this global variable called loaded _ hello world. Again, this is a command pattern that they use, which is G : stands for global variable, loaded _ stands. It's a naming pattern, and then is the plugin name. And if the plugin name already exists, it stops. And this is basically when there's multiple sourcing that happens. Or the best part about this is I can manually set like G : loaded _ hello world equals to 0, and it will not even load the plugin. So that's temporarily disabling the plugin. And then I set it to 1. Add first command. So let's go and create a command called greet, right? So you can put command, the name of the command, and then you can call a function. So in this particular case, I used a script level script scope function called s:greet. And what this basically does is it goes and pastes echo hello world on your messages, and that's really your first command that you use. Now, the problem with this is you're using one file, right? So what you want to do is you basically want to organize how and where you put your files. And rather than putting it in the plugin folder, what you do is there's a special folder called autoload, and autoload gets loaded on demand. Right. So what you usually want to do is you want to most likely put most of your Vimscript in the autoload so that it does not get evaluated during when Vimscript is starting. So that's one way to optimize your performance. Again, inside autoload, I heavily suggest you to always create a folder, the top first level folder, that is your name of the plugin. And then you can have n number of nested folders. And in this case, I had hello world / greetings.vim. So now what we are going to do is, instead of using G : or S:, we're going to use a completely different format here. And this format is not a format I came up with. This is really how Vim works. So the way to name a function inside autoload that is global or accessible outside by other files or other script files in your system or Vimscript is by using the hash symbol. So the way it works is, in this case, hello world is the name of the folder. Then it's greetings, which is the name of the file. And then the last one is the name of the function that exists in hello world / greetings in your autoload. And what it actually does is it does not look at autoload just on your folder. It looks at autoload on everyone else's folder. And this is why it's really important to have this as unique as possible. So be creative on naming. Yes, naming is hard, but be creative. Make sure you're not reusing it. But this is really how it works. So now when someone else, some other file calls hello world #greetings, it'll go and search all the autoload folders and, oh, it found hello world directory. Now let me go and look at greetings. Oh, is greeting a directory? Oh, no, it's a file. So I'm going to like read the file and then, oh, then I'll find the good morning. So that's really how you do. And then you can use the same pattern here to call it. And by default, it becomes global. You don't have to put an explicit G colon. You can put whatever you want in that. Again, you can also use script S colon to do the greetings. Again, I would highly suggest, even if you put utils, put everything under that folder. Don't put it at the top. You can also go and call other files here. Hello world greetings, good afternoon. It's possible to call even functions from other plugins, not just yours. One thing, don't worry about trying to get too much, hey, this is private, this is public, especially if you're coming from an object-oriented language. Just make sure you have some pattern, like maybe you want to start your function name with underscore if you think it's internal, or move it to a folder called internal. It's really up to you. Vim doesn't care. But by default, all these becomes global to everyone, no matter whether it's local to your plugin or other plugins. Another thing that's really important is mappings. The way to solve this mappings is by using the plug. So what I suggest is never automatically put plugs or use no remap, and then like put Control-P and then like, hey, just go and register random things there. Because one thing I've actually, I used to do that before, and what I learned is Vim folks are very much into Vim. They really need their Vim to be configured exactly the way they want. So they're really vocal about it. So you try to mess with their settings, they get really mad about it. So don't do it. You can, if you really want to do it, there's this thing called has map to, which basically says like, hey, did someone register a value or some shortcut keys to that plug? And then you can also use map check is like, hey, is this key actually available or not? And then you can register it. So in this case, what happens is when I press F9 in normal mode, it's going to call hello world greetings greet. Now here, what does Control U do? It basically, once you put a colon, it clears everything till colon and then adds call greet. CR is carriage return, which is equivalent to enter. It's optional. So you could also do call hello world greet and then like either put some space, or you can even add allow people to do it. But usually you most likely want to put Control enter, so you don't have to keep typing Control enter. One thing, especially if you're looking in terms of compatibility, is version check. I'm running a bit late, so I'll try to go as fast as possible. You can use the has function if you want to check whether it's NeoVim. You can also look at the patch number. You can also look if the function exists or not. And there are certain things you can use, such as like ## if you want to check whether the event actually works. So I actually contributed text change P. It's used by lots of autocomplete plugins to the Vim core, which is also NeoVim. So if you are working on it, definitely check that. One thing I suggest when you are creating Vimscript is set up your CI. Because it's a dynamic language, because Vimscript is weird, set up CI. Like I mentioned, like putting putting G colon is optional. There's lots of like things that can throw you off. So set up linting, add test. There's lots of testing library out there. One is document your Vim. Do not use README as much as possible. I still need to go and remove things from my README. It's primarily because apparently a lot of Vim users, they prefer help. And even I have started to use help. Before I created plugins, I used to look at README or HTML. But once I started creating plugins, I just found so much value in there. Then again, another is very much important. Document your code, pay special attention to data structure. Like if you're creating a dictionary, hey, what is the type of key, right? Is it a number? Is it a string? If it is a number or a string, what is it? Like, is it a name of the people, or it's a name of the global variables? Is it name of the window, name of the tab, number of tab? I don't know. If it's a value, which is an object, explicitly put an example. Because again, as I mentioned, Vimscript is not something you'll be writing every day. So what you'll most likely do is you'll spend like writing Vimscript for the next few days, and then, oh, like this works. And then what happened is next month, 6 months down the line or a year, you'll come back and say, oh, I need to modify, and you have no idea of what your code is doing, right? So document that are really important. Other things I wanted to also do is there's a callback.vim that I've written. If you're really looking into writing asynchronous code, it's a really good plugin. I'm explicitly using it a lot in Vim LSP. There's lots of things that's happening here. So for example, cursor moved, cursor hold. So whenever this event comes, fire something, right? When you enter or buff leave, you remove your highlights. I want to debounce my time, right? Because I want it to be performant. I want to also do distinct until change, like, hey, if things doesn't change, ignore it, right? And I also here use switch map, which is basically sends an asynchronous request to the language server. And then if it is still pending and there's some another request that happens, go and automatically cancel my request. So lots of interesting things. And it says, hey, take until, which basically means if I leave the buffer, automatically cancel it, right? So to write this code, it would actually take like thousands of lines of code. But with this, with just like few lines of code, you can do it. So if you're into observables, this is really it. And there's also Vimscript for JavaScript. I wished this was there when I started. But if you're into JavaScript, there's, I think, similar to Python too. You use that. I use this quite a lot now that it exists. It actually tells you an equivalent of JavaScript functions or methods, how to do that in Vimscript. So very important. Because there's a lot of things going on with Lua. What about Vimscript versus Lua? Well, I've personally been using a lot of Vimscript. Even in Vim LSP, most of the plugins I've used, they're actually pieces of Lua code. Especially the bottlenecks, like we have converted into Lua code, and we've seen like around 6 to 10% improvements by just converting just 1 or 2, 3 lines of Vimscript into Lua. So Lua is really fast. Like when NeoVim folks says Lua is not, it's fast. It really is fast. But it really depends on you. Most of the plugins, Vimscript is okay. So first is, pick whichever one you want. There's not much thing about it. Another is there's also a Vim and NeoVim Lua compatibility that I've been working on. And I've ported a lot of NeoVim features into Vim. And there's special things I've also ported from Vim to NeoVim. So, which means you can actually use Lua for both Vim and NeoVim. There are still few ones that I've not, but 1.25.3.7 is really the plugin to do. So you can actually start building Lua plugins that are compatible and works with both Vim and NeoVim. Just make sure you do the version checks or feature checks. And that's all. Sorry for taking quite some time, I think. But hey, Adam, feel free to, I think, if there are no questions or let me just check. Since I've been quite late, I'm going to stop sharing so the next one can start pretty soon.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much for the good talk. I'm sure so many people benefited from just seeing all of Vim, Vimscript. I know that I struggle with learning that. It's not something that I do all the time, but thank you very much for taking the time to do that. TJ's session right now is actually continuing to go on. He's actually shamelessly promoting his Twitch right now. Get in there and check it out. But as of right now, we have to shift the schedule down a little bit, so we're going to probably run a touch longer than we wanted to. So